And this year's ultimate winner is the restaurant responsible for starting the movement in the first place. At number 1, the best restaurant in Europe and the world's best restaurant 2021 is Noma.
Hello, and welcome to What the Denmark, the show that explains things that seem peculiar as an outsider in Denmark.
This week, we're talking about new Nordic cuisine. As you'll hear, we speak about the foundations of the Nordic food revolution that started in 2004, and how this could lead to a more innovative and sustainable way to make food. A week after our recording, some exciting news hit. In the list of the world's 50 best restaurants, the top 2 in the whole world, Noma and Geranium, were from here, in small little Denmark. We don't reference the win in this episode, but you should get a flavour for the roots of this food movement and how it ultimately led to the highest recognition in the culinary world. Also, just a quick note that Josephine couldn't make it for this recording, but don't worry, she'll be back next week.
Good to go?
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Jonas Astrup has been part of the new Nordic cuisine movement since its inception and is now head of food innovation at Meyers Malhus. Previously, he's worked at the Nordic Food Lab in product development, and throughout his career he's experimented with food and how it leads to new purpose and context within everyday life. Today we talk with Jonas about the history and impact of the new Nordic cuisine, how far it's come since its inception in 2004, and how being a Dane might have influenced his own experiences with working with food and putting Danish cuisine on the map. So Jonas, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So to get us started, what is New Nordic Cuisine?
The New Nordic Cuisine was founded on a manifesto, and the manifesto was put together by different stakeholders almost 16 years ago.
I mean, this sounds a bit like the Declaration of Independence. So this is sort of a coming together of many people saying, we think something's wrong, we're going to put right down on a piece of paper what it's going to be and make this change. What was it that caused this revolution? What was it that sort of led to this?
I think a few things. One of them was that with inspiration from part of the Danish film industry, they saw how powerful you could turn movies into international success and blockbusters if you laid down a few set of rules and was very clear about them and did it with the aesthetics and, what could you say, narratives that would reflect Scandinavia. So that was one part of the inspiration. Another part would be that if you take a look at how the Danish culinary landscape would look like before this manifesto was written, it was very, very different from what we see today.
Go on. So what was it like? And was it ever called Old Nordic Cuisine, or was it just Danish food?
It was probably just Danish food.
Okay.
I mean, if you were a chef back then and you wanted to develop yourself as a chef or as a cook, you would probably not go to either Copenhagen or Aarhus or any other where here in Denmark now. You would probably go to France or Italy or even Spain back when El Bulli was the number 1 restaurant in the world. So there was definitely this, what could you say, vacuum of either quality, raw ingredients quality, the quality of the raw ingredients here. There was not really a narrative. And then that has changed quite a lot, I would say, significantly throughout the last 15 years.
So was there some sort of like crisis? It almost sounds like there was a crisis, or there was a sense of like, we need to really up our game here. And you say that this sort of collective came together and they said, okay, we're going to write down these principles, this framework that means that we're going to, define the industry. I mean, it's curious how from the beginning this sounds like it was a group, like industry thing, rather than just one restaurant saying, we're going to be the best restaurant and we're going to keep these principles to ourselves. It seems like it was sort of always meant for the masses.
You could always argue whether going to a restaurant Noma today and pay, 3,500 Danish kroners would be for the masses. However, the restaurant and many other restaurants throughout the last decade or so has definitely showed that you were able to make food and cook food here in not only Denmark, but also Sweden, Norway, Faroe Islands, and Iceland, differently from what you would used to utilize the ingredients from our wild landscapes and to gather with the producers of the ingredients that you would use in a kitchen today and transform the way we eat, basically. And that has we've come pretty far now, I would say.
What are some of the sort of core principles of New Nordic Cuisine then?
Well, first of all, that you should utilize the things and the raw materials that are in season in our own landscapes. I just want to add to that sometimes the New Nordic Manifesto has been, I would say, a little bit misunderstood, because it's not really a crusade against satar or cumin or hummus or whatever you can find outside Scandinavia. It's focused and laid down some ideals and principles that you should utilize whatever you have around you in season, because it makes good sense in numerous levels. First of all, because when you utilize raw materials and ingredients that are in season, you would most oftenly make delicious food. And maybe the New Nordic Manifesto was a bit ahead of its time back then. It makes quite a lot of sense that we should use apples whenever they're in season here, not, have them on an airplane from Australia or New Zealand. And that, of course, brings you as a chef and as a cook, whether that be a professional or a home cook, it brings you a bit closer to Mother Nature and what's around you.
Got it. Okay. And was there any resistance to this?
Tons. As far as I remember, Restaurant Noma was called, seal fuckers and others and other kinds of, adjectives in that category. Because suddenly you would go and utilize and make food and meals with ingredients that hasn't been a focal point on the Danish plates for, probably centuries.
So, I mean, that seems like some quite serious, animosity towards it. Why were people so offended by what Noma was doing?
I think what has characterized, you could say, food and how we've produced food in Denmark before the New Nordic Manifesto has been, you probably know brands like Lurpak and
butter.
Butter, basically. Yeah. And we also...
I mean, the big thing growing up in England was butter and bacon. That's what Denmark was known for.
There you go.
Yeah.
And those types of products are, I'm sure, well safe. I mean, food safety has been one of the quality parameters that has enabled the Danish industry to enlarge over time. But then suddenly these chefs came along and wanted to do food that actually had deliciousness or taste as their primary. That turned some things around and upside down for a lot of people.
Okay, so what would a typical dish be in Denmark in before 2004?
On the plate back home for in a normal Danish family, it would probably be, or it would be, and is to a large extent still, potatoes, frikadeller, these small, meatballs, and a bit of gravy, and different types of pork cuts.
That's sort of the characteristic,
absolutely
old sort of Danish food.
Or you would find lasagna, pizza, stuff that came from, the other side of the border and from south of Europe.
Okay, but what's sort of an entry level New Nordic cuisine dish that someone might have these days? We're recording this at the end of September, so I imagine seasonality is important. So what would be a sort of typical accessible New Nordic cuisine dish you could have today?
I mean, one of the dishes that became popular, or I would say iconic, in the early stages of Restaurant Noma.
And just when we talk about Noma, this was sort of the pioneering restaurant,
absolutely, that
went on to become the best restaurant in the world.
Yeah.
And this is, my understanding at least, is that they are sort of the restaurant that drove forward New Nordic cuisine. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair assessment?
I would say that would be reasonable, at least in an international perspective, but also on a national perspective, absolutely.
But yes, so you're saying?
I mean, one of the dishes that in the early ages of Restaurant Noma was a dessert made out of øllebrød. And øllebrød might sound a bit difficult to pronounce, but it's basically a porridge made out of old rugbrød, which is rye bread, made into a porridge with a bit of beer. Most oftenly eat that with here in Denmark with a bit of whipped cream or something like that, or just cream, basically. And they turned it into a dessert, sweetened it slightly, added a very light sort of foam and a quenelle of a rhubarb sorbet. And I remember when I had it the first time, I thought, wow, a very familiar flavor to me, øllebrød. But suddenly it was put into a fine dining setting, and it was tweaked a bit. And obviously, then Noma has evolved, a million times since, and today is somewhere between an art institution and the pinnacle of deliciousness.
Now we can sort of talk about your involvement in New Nordic Cuisine. Where did your relationship with food really begin?
It began with a meal, basically. I would say rather young. I just came to Copenhagen from a small town in the middle part of Jylland, in Jutland. And I was so fortunate to get some new friends, and some of those were in the food industry as chefs. One night got a table at a restaurant, there's no more, but I just remember that the meal was fantastic. I can only remember one dish.
Go on.
And it was not even New Nordic. It was, I think it was 36-month aged Comté, and we had a glass of aged wine as well. That was probably what I remember. But I woke up the day after, and I've never done drugs, but if I did, I would assume that the addiction and the need that I felt that day was something similar to what you would feel like if you were a drug addict. I was left discouraged, or because I was simply unaware of what my next meal should be. I had such a hard time to come up with what should I have for dinner now.
Oh my gosh!
And that hasn't at that point ever been a problem for me.
So how I'm trying to picture. So how old were you at this point?
I was in my 21, 22.
21? Okay,
Yeah.
and had you enjoyed food growing up, or was it just sort of part of your life?
Well, I've probably enjoyed it, but I've never sort of I've never went in depth with it. I wouldn't say spiritual level, but there was something more to the meal than just the nourishment of my organism.
And then this was the first step, was it, on your journey into working with food, or?
It was, I would say, it wasn't a turning point, but it was definitely, well, you could say it was a turning point. It was definitely a point in my life where I realized that there was more to the meal and the flavors that made me realize there was something there, and I needed to pursue it a bit more. I didn't know at that point how I should do it, but it caught my attention.
Interesting. So you decided to go food science and not train to be a chef.
Yeah.
What's the sort of distinction?
Food science is, some of the science behind food, you could say, or in food, rather. And what I found when I began studying food science is that quality that I just found out recently at a restaurant had not so much to do with our ability to reproduce things and make all foods look like the same. But there was something more to it. But what I found at the university as quality in the industry was reproducibility, food safety, those two perhaps. Of course, I had to deal with that when I did my studies. So I've worked with microbiology, food chemistry, measured how liquids would go through a pipe and how fast you can heat things up in, big scale.
How quickly you can melt butter.
Something like that, basically. So the Nordic Food Lab was set up as a non-for-profit organization, initiated by Claus and also René from Noma and a few others. And it was on a houseboat, actually, on Harborside, just next to Noma and Christianshavn. The organization, or Nordic Food Lab, were back then supposed to do research within what is edible, what is not edible within the Nordic region, basically. And to do explorations, but also, you could say, develop new flavors and techniques that could be applied in restaurants and in home kitchens. Mm-hmm. That was the idea behind Nordic Food Lab.
Okay. How do you test whether a food is edible or not?
You taste it.
And then if you get ill?
Put it into your mouth.
Really, there's no... I was kind of... so I was kind of hoping there'd be some science. We put it under the microscope and we see this thing. No, really, you just taste it and see if you get ill.
Well, from a chef point of view, that would be how you would do it most oftenly, of course. I mean, if mold turns green and blue, you would try to avoid it.
Yeah.
That was quite interesting. Sometimes we had microbiologists paying us a visit, and we were growing different types of molds and bacteria. You should have seen the expressions on their faces. Sometimes, coming from a very controlled environment, as a laboratory at the university was very much different from
being on a houseboat.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Denmark is by far one of the
meatiest countries in the.
Well, you could say it's one of the meatiest, even though we only, and we're pretty good at producing a sufficient amount of, especially pork.
Mm-hmm.
However, we eat quite a lot of meat per capita on an average, and we all know that eating meat to this extent does no good for the planet that we share with one another, and also going to share with the generations that hasn't yet been born. Which means that we need to pay focus on vegetables and everything from the plant kingdom, as well as the kingdom that complies fungi and perhaps also algae. But what you do take away when you take away your piece of meat on your plate is the basic tastes called umami.
Mm-hmm.
And you might know umami as this sort of like almost like meaty kind of sensation you feel especially when you eat meat, of course, but also when you enjoy the wonderful mixture of bolognese and parmigiano, tomato sauce.
Mm-hmm.
All those components has some of the components of umami. So you need to work with vegetables and greens differently.
Mm-hmm.
And one way you could do that would be through fermentation. Fermentation, I believe, is going to be one of the keys to a greener plate going forward.
And that's because fermentation is a way to bring in this umami flavor without animals.
It is definitely one way to come about it. When I say it's a key, I mean it sort of like unlocks some of the potential that some plant-based materials possess. A lot of plant-based ingredients, plants, of course, contains proteins as well as carbohydrates and other stuff. In order to get the sensation of umami, you need to break down those larger macromolecules, let's say proteins, into much smaller bites known as glutamate and nucleotides and such. And you need fermentation, the activity of, for instance, bacteria and fungi to do this kind of work. And if you do that, you can make small, very potent, umami-rich condiments. You already know them. You probably have a bottle of soy sauce in your kitchen already. You could do that with ingredients from this area and region too.
Got it. So umami with meat is basically just the molecular structure of meat means that when it's cooked, it naturally, these big macro molecules break down and release the umami flavor. But you require a bit more work to do that with plants. Is that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, you got it right.
Okay.
So this would be obviously one way to do it. And another thing you need to be aware of is that when you take out meat, you would also, there's this mouthfeel, textural consistency that you need to replace. And you could do that with some plants, but you could also do it with mushrooms and fungi.
And if I'm right, a big part of the Nordic cuisine philosophy is to use local ingredients. So what are some of the contenders in Denmark for plants or plant-based foods that can give that can be at the forefront of Danish food for the next 100 years?
Part of that is legumes. Okay. And so what you see right now in Denmark is that there's a growing interest in legumes for numerous reasons. First of all,
legumes, they're like lentils.
That could be lentils, split peas,
beans, or
beans,
like the black beans,
chickpeas. Chickpeas. Yeah, it's actually part of the second largest family within the plant kingdom. So there's
So what's the first?
That would be the grass family.
The grass. So grass. That's like wheat, barley.
Exactly.
Okay.
We're actually told that. One of the advices is that you should eat 100 grams of cooked legumes per day.
Okay.
And I think on average, a Dane would eat somewhere between, is it 3, 4, 5 grams per day? So almost like zero, basically.
And this is like the government guidelines
exactly.
on like what is the optimal meal. So it might say, I'm trying to think, when I was growing up, you might have said, have meat 3 times a week, have 5 fruit and vegetables a day. Sorry, stuff like that. My understanding when I was growing up was that was purely for what is good for your body.
Mm-hmm.
What is the right combination of meat and dairy and other things. And are you saying that the guidelines then broadened their remit to say it's both what's good for you as a person and for the planet?
Exactly.
That seems like was that a controversial thing?
I don't think it's sort of like sparkled any, resistance, if you could say. It might be different in other parts of the world. The green agenda has just, our last election here in Denmark was also, dominated by climate discussions, the climate debate, the climate agenda. So I think it came in quite natural.
Okay. And then the big takeaway is eat more legumes.
That's one of them. Exactly.
Okay.
But eating legumes has numerous advantages, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
From an agricultural point of view, most legumes are able to bind and to fix nitrogen within the soil. Mm-hmm. So you would use legumes when intercropping on your land. That's one thing that's good. Usually we would use all the legumes that we produce for animal feed.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I remember, up to 70% of the grains that we produce is turned into animal feed because we produce so many animals here. If you take a look at our culinary history, especially on the countryside, we've eaten quite a lot of legumes 100 years ago. Actually, parts of Denmark has been producing so many legumes that we were able to export it to other countries.
Where do you see New Nordic Cuisine going in the next 5 years, other than just more legumes?
For most companies nowadays, not talking food industry only, it would be extremely difficult to be relevant if we weren't able to tackle and combat issues on sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, if you take a look at the development goals laid down by UN, more than half of those goals somehow, one way or another, is related to how we produce and eat food around the world. Mm. I think part of what was laid down in the manifesto already, back then, did tackle some of the issues that we are combating today when it comes to how to eat in a sustainable fashion.
Mm.
So, in other words, the values are just as relevant today as they were back then.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that's going to... It seems that the movement has sort of taken aim at certain dishes, or sort of said, oh, how can we reinvent ulukol? All right?
Yeah, ulukol. Yeah.
Ulukol.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, how can they reinvent ulukol? How can they reinvent some of these particular dishes? Is there anything from your perspective that you think is missing? Is there anything that you think, we could do with reinventing licorice or bread or something? Is there anything that you're quite keen to do?
Denmark is it's not a big country. It's a little more than 6 million. Globally, we're just a very small corner, or small dot on the globus. But what we still lack, or what I find is still difficult in parts of Denmark, or I would say differently, even though we're only 6 million people, you would find huge differences in the way that we eat. If you take a look at what we put in a plate in let's say in Copenhagen, for instance, or in Aarhus. But nevertheless, there's a huge difference in what you put on the plate, depending on where you come from in Denmark. Also depends largely to what your social capabilities are, your level of education, and so on. So there's still you could say, a social gradient in Denmark when it comes to health and the way you eat. So my point is that we still haven't sort of democratized the potentials of the New Nordic Cuisine yet. Obviously, a lot of things have happened also for the better, but we still need to get into every corner of this small kingdom.
What's the best way to do that?
You need to play various instruments, I think, and obviously education is one of them. Perhaps what has made me proud the most has been how we've done it collectively. As chefs and restaurateurs, you would most often find them as being friends and good colleagues rather than being sort of enemies, rivals.
Yeah.
And so people share recipes and is a bit more open source that you would probably find somewhere else.
Why do you think that is?
Wow. I think some of it comes from, I wouldn't say like a Danish mentality, but there's definitely some structural things in our small country that has made that possible. What characterizes Denmark and other sort of similar countries is that there's a large degree of trust in between people.
Mm.
The amount of corruption in Denmark is, compared to other countries, fairly low. And I think some of those sort of concepts has been vital to the success of the New Nordic Cuisine and how the movement has been able to grow, at least in Copenhagen and in other places in Denmark too.
Mm. I'm just thinking, if you work in food innovation, and so let's say you've sort of been spending months and months and months, you finally crack how to make whatever it is, and then you're going for a beer with one of your friends, and they say, "Oh, we're trying to figure out how to ferment this lentil." Would you be open to sharing it in that situation, or would you sort of feel a bit like, "Oh, I want to keep this one to myself"?
Well, I represent an organization and a company that is, has put out recipes for the last 2 decades or so, also for free.
Okay.
And sometimes we publish a book and then you need to buy them. But if you're a bit generous with your knowledge and your skills and your recipes, you could sparkle interest in some people. I think a very good example today would be that you could find baking recipes all over the internet, instructional videos for free. Flour is not that expensive. So it's quite easy to get started baking.
Mm.
And I also come from a company that does, baking classes and other types of cooking classes. And even though we've just shared these recipes for free, we've never been busier teaching people who actually pays us to teach them how to bake. But to get back to the point, I mean, I think different actors and players within the food chain, if you could say, also when it comes to product development, and there's been a large degree of trust in between those chains.
Trust in what? I don't. Yeah.
Well, trust might not be it's not perhaps not the perfect or the ideal phrasing here, but there's been a common understanding of something different from what we're used to back before the New Nordic Manifesto. Of course, the product should be safe to eat and stuff, but at some point we've changed the discussion, the narrative a bit. So now we also discuss taste with producers who are perhaps not familiar with discussing taste, and we sort of have like a common understanding of that what we do now should taste good. And one way to come around that discussion would also be to be a bit more open about your economic calculations when doing products.
Yeah. So I think, would this be, for example, like if you are running a restaurant and you have a supplier who gives you peas, and
good example,
and you're saying, before you might just be right, we need to get these peas for as cheap as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to bargain pretty hard with this pea producer. Whereas now you might be almost inviting in the producer and saying, this is what we're going to do with the peas. This is what we want to do. How can you produce them in the way which is going to give the optimal flavour? Things like that.
Wonderful example. So the Manifesto sparkled a new conversation. And that conversation was between producers and, you could say, end users or chefs.
Mm-hmm.
When you begin such a conversation, suddenly you also questions whether or not you should produce this type of pea because it gives you that much of yield, rather than this pea because this pea doesn't yield as much, but damn, it tastes good. So, and then suddenly you have this kind of discussion, and that's how part of the food culture evolves.
I think I've read earlier that you worked quite a lot in the bakery section.
Yeah.
Bakery section. Makes it sound like you work at a supermarket. So you worked a lot with baking.
Mm-hmm.
What is your favourite Danish pastry?
Whoa. I really enjoy spandau. It's the combination of pastry and this sort of like, cream.
Yes, can do it. Yeah. And then you have some great Danish butter to go with it. And it's just
I mean,
winning
you
combination.
don't need that much more. But the bread scene has changed, I mean, significantly, especially in Copenhagen, but not only in Copenhagen right now. You see small micro bakeries popping up all over Denmark now. It's quite fascinating to be witnessing.
To be part of that, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that might actually be a part of democratizing the new Nordic cuisine, I would say, when it comes to bread at least.
Really? Is in making these or having these micro bakeries all around the country?
Exactly. Suddenly you would find this conversation between, farmers who produce wheat, other varieties of grains, with bakers, craftsmen, and also consumers. So suddenly the landscape changes, and you would utilize whatever we have here differently. So instead of, feeding pigs with whatever we produce, we start making bread instead.
Yeah.
What happens is that you diversify whatever is out there when it comes to bread. So bread is not only something you would find in a bag on the supermarket shelves, but also something that you could buy almost straight from the oven with the guy or the woman that you might know in the bakery. That's quite interesting to follow right now.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Jonas, what do you have for breakfast? What's like a normal breakfast for you?
Fermented stuff.
Really, you have fermented stuff for breakfast?
Well, I mean, you probably have your cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Cup of joe.
Yeah.
Which is a fermented food. I had a roll, sourdough roll. Today is actually the National Danish Food Waste Day, you could say. So I was at a event this morning with our Princess Marie and the Danish Minister of Food and Agriculture, Rasmus Prehn. And we were served coffee. There you go, fermented stuff.
Yeah.
A bread, a roll, fermented stuff.
Yeah.
And I've added a bit of butter and a slice of cheese on it. So there you go, another fermented stuff, right?
Awesome.
So that was the 3 fermented food items there.
Nice. I bet you're glad I asked that question. What did you have for breakfast this morning? Oh, it's just with Princess Marie and this bar.
No, but what I wanted to. That was not to brag on anything. Because I don't really know, but what I wanted to address here is that we have, perhaps even more importantly than I had 3 fermented foods for breakfast, that we have huge issues with food waste, and not only here but globally. I mean, we could feed 2 billion people if we got rid of food waste. One of the ideas behind the new Nordic Kitchen Manifesto, one of the values would also be to utilize your raw materials efficiently. And if you do that, you could, pay more money for the stuff you get into the kitchen and get more out of it. And that's also one way to tackle and come around food waste. I mean, I think the minister today said that the amount of food that we waste in Denmark equals that, that every Dane for a period of 2 months should throw out their everyday meal. That's quite significantly.
So is it food waste is like stuff you buy that then goes off before you eat it, or is it? Yeah, what is it?
You would find food waste in different parts of the value chain.
Okay.
Obviously, there's the food waste connected to the primary production. You would find food waste in the retail industry and in the supermarkets, and you would also find
that's so in the supermarkets. That's they buy more stuff than they can sell.
Exactly.
Okay.
You also have food waste in professional kitchens, canteens and larger production units, bakeries.
Yeah.
I believe that bread, flour, and pasta and stuff is some of the stuff that I think it's even number 1 category of food waste when it comes to private households. Yeah. And one of our roles in where I'm from would be to give away free recipes on how to utilize
stale bread rolls
and stuff like that.
That was a big thing I remember in the UK was something about wonky bananas or something, or wonky carrots, and that being like suddenly we're going to allow wonky carrots to sort of come on the shelves.
And that is perhaps also a result of one of the outcomes of the new Nordic Cuisine Manifesto, that we tried to tackle what has been sort of like industry standards for the last 100 years, or at least to try to question them. That's why you see Eat Grim, Eat Creme, and the other day I saw tomato sauce made out of tomatoes that would usually have been discarded because of like a brown mark or something like that.
And that is sort of real innovation or like going against the status quo. How do you like create an environment where that becomes encouraged or people start doing it? Because I imagine, up until 2003, people just like, well, that's the way it's always been done.
Yeah.
And then something's happened where you've sort of been able to create this environment where suddenly like everything's been questioned.
Yeah.
How has it been possible to create that environment?
Part of my answer would be because of sort of like the democratic institutions and the democratic discussions that we have here on a daily basis. But I sometimes say, love your country enough to criticize it. So you need to have open-minded, or you need to be able to have open-minded, honest discussions on issues such as food quality. And one of the things that I find hard is that whenever you talk about meals and food, you talk about something that is intimate to a lot of you or to a lot of people. I mean, to most people, basically, because we literally take bites and pieces of the world and integrate it into our bodies. And most people probably argue that no one should ever decide what I should have for dinner. So I'm back at our consumption of meat because at some point we need to discuss how we come around those issues of eating too much meat, basically. And, that needs a good, thoroughly honest, it's a difficult one, but a good discussion, good democratic discussion, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and democracies, you've seen that all over the world, needs to be stimulated. Otherwise, it falls into the hands of demagogues and people with less good intentions.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, during the corona pandemic here in Denmark, you would have, our prime minister would go on the screen, if not every day, then quite oftenly. Then the IPCC report came out not that long ago. There hasn't been even a single press conference on the fact that this report came out from a prime minister addressing the most urgent thing to solve for humanity. I think that's mind-boggling. And throughout the pandemic, we often heard a word or a phrase of social contract. You need to be vaccinated in order for
the good of everyone.
Exactly. Yeah. But I find it extremely difficult and sad that you won't. It's not my experience. You don't find the same social contract when it comes to the way that we eat, basically. Most young people are pretty well aware that you should eat greener, plant-based, less meat. You should perhaps also consider whether or not it's produced conventionally or organic. Organic is a quite funny one because show me some food that is not organic. That's a semantic discussion. So we need to address this social contract when it comes to our eating habits and the way we produce food, for sure. Yeah.
For something which should be as urgent as coronavirus, as you say, arguably more so, that there's not this show of public or this, the state coming out and saying it, really. And even though it's a very small step, I think that thing you said about the recommendations going from being what's good for you, meat and vegetables, to now being what's good for you and the climate, sort of seems like, a very small step towards that. But I think trying to, because you're right, those principles that were made in that manifesto in 2004 seems very consistent or coherent with sustainability, etc. And it's just how that then becomes something which is part of everyone's concern, as opposed to just, oh, this is mine, and it's outside
absolutely
of that. Yeah.
And the manifesto was also adopted by the Nordic Council of Ministers. So ministers from the Nordic countries, and has been used as a framework for work in in that group.
There was this big discussion about having 2 meals a week vegetarian in public canteens.
Oh yeah.
And then that got voted against.
Exactly.
So were you part of this, or was that part of the consultancy?
No, but I think that was framed. I mean, I should really consider my use of words, but I think that was framed disadvantageously.
Yeah.
What you should have done, you should just have for each meal you have that where meat were part of it, You should just have like reduced it with like 10% or
and that would,
15%, and that would have equaled out
the same thing.
The result.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking on that was make meat a dietary option. So the default is vegetarian, but if you really want meat, then you have to tick a box to say I'll have meat.
That's. I mean, we run, almost 90 canteens, and serves 500,000 meals a month.
Yeah,
and that has been one of the ways for us to reduce the meat consumptions overall in our canteens.
Yeah, make it opt-in. Not
exactly.
Yeah,
serving food on plates has reduced our food waste significantly. And spending less money. I mean, it's good business.
Yeah,
to eat less meat.
Yeah,
especially if you have requirements for how the animals has come around, and then throw out less food. I mean, food waste is 1-to-1.
Yeah,
smart, bad.
Cool. So people can come into Meyer's Malhus.
Sure.
Which what I think is quite funny is that as a non-Danish speaker, it sounds like madhouse.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is great.
Well, but it is a madhouse.
It is also
sometimes.
a madhouse. It is also a madhouse.
Trust me.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But get into more sustainable eating habits. Would obviously be to do some of the stuff that we've talked about. Eat less animal, eat less meat. But one of my favorite advices would be try to plan out the meals you're supposed to have or want to have throughout a week or so, or 5 days. But if you start planning stuff, you would realize how much more time you would be given throughout the week, and also how much easier some of the meals just comes to you. You can do a bit of extra roasted potatoes on Monday, and it would fit in a meal perfectly on Tuesday or Wednesday, and you would save yourself a bit of time because you
cooked ahead.
You've already cooked ahead, so planning is definitely
a good way to go. Where can people learn more about you?
Well, I'm situated at Meyers Madhus on Nørrebrogade.
Okay. And can people who are members of the public, can they go in and book themselves in? And
yeah, no problem.
Cool. Anything else you'd like to say, Jonas?
Thank you so much for inviting me in. I really hope that what I said could be useful in your...
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thanks for listening to this episode of What the Denmark. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, then head to whatthedenmark.com. You can follow our Facebook group to discuss the ideas in this episode, and do consider telling a friend about the podcast if you think they'd enjoy it. Thanks to everyone who has helped in the creation of the episode, including Andreas Poulsen, Jack Jørn, Tevin Sudi, and Mia Treiling. As always, time for our Danish sign-off. Vi ses næste gang. Anything jumping out to you, or any burning questions?
No, I really wanted to declare my love for beans, actually.
Yeah.
Before, it's the best all the time. Yeah.